Assalamu alaikum, dear students. This session is about diachronic changes in English language, introducing some terms. Well, I hope and expect that by the end of this session, you would have further clarity and understanding of what is diachronic linguistics and what are important terms related to it. At the outset, I would like to talk about the scope and the concerns related to diachronic linguistics. Well, to describe and account for observed changes in a particular language. This is what is the focus of diachronic linguistics. In fact, to reconstruct the prehistory of languages and to determine their relatedness and grouping them into different language families has been one of the major focuses of diachronic linguistics. Linguists and historical linguists, they have studied how different languages in their ancestry, they connect with each other. Tracing the history of languages, the current, sister languages or cousin languages, how they have a parent language and a grandparent language and a great-grandparent language and a great-great-grandparent language, tracing thus it back in the history. This has been one of the major focuses of diachronic linguistics, and a lot of theories have been presented in this regard. To describe the history of communities, this is another aspect of the scope of diachronic linguistics. Because, every linguistic community historically passes through different phases of its life. There are certain ups and downs, there are certain changes through the times, there are, certain evolutions, there are, certain modifications in the linguistic behaviors, etc. And all these linguistic behaviors depend upon the socio-political and cultural context that again keeps on changing on through the times. And diachronic linguists, they try to describe through the historical evidence how, the history of communities differ. Another aspect of the scope of diachronic linguistics is to study the history of words, that is etymology. If currently we have a word, how was it formed in the past? Where did it come from? What was the origin? Which language family it belongs to? Is it borrowed from some other language? Is it created, coined in the same language? Is it modified over the times, etc.? One major area, as I have already said, of the scope of diachronic linguistics is tracing the family history of languages. So different models for these family trees have been presented by different theorists and by different linguists. The first attempts that were made at depicting the relationships between languages through these families were actually by theorizing how they are connected. There were certain assumptions that we come across that were presented through the times. So, for example, the regularity hypothesis was presented. In fact, we would talk about the regularity hypothesis and we would talk about the relatedness hypothesis. The regularity hypothesis says that the change that takes place in a language over the times is regular. It's not abrupt. It's not that someday you would wake up in the morning and there would be a change in the language. It's a regular, a constant process that takes place slowly and gradually. The second hypothesis is of relatedness. Changes in a language are related. Languages have interconnections, and the changes in the languages also have interconnections. No change can occur, again in isolation without having any connection. There would always be a connecting point if you study the history. I would also talk about the wave model that was given with reference to, language change. In diachronic linguistics, the wave model says that instead of having definite delineations between languages, there are waves of linguistic change which affect some languages but not others and tend to spread out to other languages nearby. So, according to the wave model, it's like when there is a wave, how it moves. What they mean by that is that a change in a language does not occur in isolation, but, changes in languages are like waves. A certain change would come that, like a wave, would cover certain languages. However, there would be certain other languages that it would not cover. So, covering certain languages, not covering certain languages, how, this wave-like movement would go on. For many scholars or linguists, a legitimate target of research involves focus not on changes over time, but on the synchronic grammatical systems of earlier language stages. So this is how, synchronic linguistics links with diachronic linguistics and how it complements that. This practice, by the way, can be called old-time synchrony. You are doing historical linguistics, you are doing historical study of language because you're studying language somewhere in the past. But to understand that past, you are comparing there at some other time point in the history back. You are making certain comparisons which are, of course, synchronic. This is a necessary prerequisite for doing serious work on the diachronic development of languages. And, of course, when you want to study a language in historical context, at every time point, you need to make comparisons and contrasts between the existing languages at that time point. Without that, diachronic study probably would be very difficult and would have not much fruit. Another term with reference to diachronic linguistics that I would like to introduce is language contact. The social and linguistic phenomenon by which speakers of different languages interact with one another, leading to a transfer of linguistic features. This is what is called language contact. Language fact, in fact, is a major factor of changing a language. Language change mainly occurs through language contact, and through, historical perspective from the diachronic lens, if we look at this, actually this contact leads through the times to particular changes in any language. Prolonged language contact generally leads to bilingualism or multilingualism. Bilingualism is the ability to use more than one language, that is using two languages at a time, whereas multilingualism refers to the ability to use more than two languages, multiple languages at a time. How, language contact affects. To give you an example of that, I would talk about Old English and Old Norse. Contact-induced grammaticalization is another term that I am introducing with reference to language contact. Well, language contact often brings about loss of grammatical categories, and this is called contact-induced grammaticalization. As an example, I would say when there was a contact between Old Norse and Old English, what happened, as these, the Danish Vikings, they came through the 9th and to the 11th centuries to the British Isles, there was, a change in the grammatical structure of the Old English language. So, this is how through, contact with other languages, languages change over the times.